The Japanese internment camps of 1942 were the result of a fearful encounter between Japanese Americans and the American public due to World War II. The 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor intensified racism toward Japanese Americans, triggering popular support for their containment. Hesitant at first, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which forced the internment of Japanese Americans, ultimately violating their civil rights of being treated fair and equal. The 9/11 terrorist attacks generated mass fear and led to the discrimination of people with a different background. Therefore, the United States should explore and understand the effects of hysteria so as to prevent it from reoccurring. Anti-Japanese sentiment started with the arrival of the first wave of Japanese immigrants in 1886. Japan ended their period of isolation when they opened their borders to immigration in 1854 by signing the Treaty of Kanagawa, solidifying American-Japanese relations. The failed result of the Meiji Restoration in 1868 was the final push that led the Japanese to immigrate to America for its stable and flourishing economy. Previous to their arrival, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 restricted the number of Chinese immigrants coming into the country and therefore limited the number of cheap laborers. From 1890 to 1924, Japanese men answered America's need for continuous cheap labor, but this frightened American laborers. Many Japanese proved to be skilled farmers by cultivating what white farmers saw as unusable land. Japanese immigrants encountered racism, not only from being viewed as outsiders, but because their success threatened white farmers. Later, the relationship between America and Japan was jeopardized during the Sino-Japanese conflict. Japan wanted to become an independent empire instead of depending on other strong nations. To achieve their goal, they hoped to expand their growing empire by invading China in 1937, but America did not support their actions. President Roosevelt impeded the Japanese from receiving American oil, which they deeply depended on for the war. Nonetheless, Japan was persistent and refused to end the war. Subsequently, Japan realized that they did not like the influence the United States had on Asia, so they bombed Hawaii's naval base, Pearl Harbor, in 1941. Before Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans had just started to become accepted into American society. However, Pearl Harbor forestalled any chance of that happening. Immediately after the tragic event, Japanese Americans were accused of spying and sending information to Japan. It happened so fast that a 14-year-old Japanese American named Richard Babe Kurosawa, nicknamed after the infamous baseball hero, was told by his close friend, "Hey Babe, you're an enemy now." As a result, many Japanese made the swift decision to burn all traces of their Japanese heritage as a sign of their loyalty to the United States. As much as the Japanese Americans denied that they were responsible for the bombing, no one believed them. The FBI investigated all persons of Japanese descent for the safety of the country, but did not come up with any evidence of betrayal. Nevertheless, this investigation did not affect the stance of the public. Pearl Harbor created a dramatic shift in perspective upon Japanese Americans, causing an unwanted and unexpected encounter, which further deepened the animosity toward the Japanese. Although Japanese Americans unceasingly tried to prove their loyalty to the United States, it was not enough to satisfy feelings of hostility. Military generals such as General John L. DeWitt were angry about Pearl Harbor and wanted retribution. The public reflected the military's apprehension and pushed for FDR to make a change. His cabinet disagreed, believing that interning the Japanese was unconstitutional and unnecessary. Despite the conflicting views, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which forced all Japanese Americans west of the Sierra Nevada mountains into internment camps on February 19, 1942. Once Executive Order 9066 was signed, there were mixed feelings of fear, confusion, and surprise. Copies of the order were posted all around Japanese neighborhoods along with evacuation notices, giving them only a few days to pack what they could carry and sell the rest. Nevertheless, the public began to see the executive order as an excuse to treat Japanese Americans unfairly. Normally Caucasians would not be seen within Japanese neighborhoods, but once the evacuation notices went up, they would walk into a Japanese house and ask to pay less than half the cost of an expensive item. As a result, many Japanese were cheated of their money. If they didn't accept the price, the buyers would threaten to take it for free once they were gone. They had no choice. Japanese businesses went on sales, and farmers ended up selling their tractors for only $50 of the $500 they were worth. Clearly, Japanese Americans had begun to suffer from the impact of the perspective-changing encounter. After evacuation, Japanese Americans were not brought straight to the camps that they would live in for the next 3 years, but to temporary relocation centers. These overcrowded centers held over 18,000 people. The centers lacked the regulation of basic human dignity, such as privacy, a mentally and physically safe environment, and enough room to breathe fresh air. The government no longer recognized Japanese Americans by name, but they were rather identified by a combination of numbers found on the tag they were given. Everything was shared in the center, including a communal-style bathroom that was not accommodated for privacy. Out of embarrassment, women and girls tended to bring pieces of wood as a makeshift door, sometimes going to the bathroom at night when no one could see. In confusion, an intern 6-year-old boy declared, "Mommy, let's go back to America." The conditions of the internment camps did not improve from the temporary relocation centers. The internment camps were not prepared and ready by the time the Japanese were forced to relocate. Workers each made an average of 20 buildings a day, leading to poor building conditions. Japanese Americans were even encouraged to help build the camps that they would eventually be living in. Many volunteered just to show their loyalty to America, still hoping that it was all a dream that would soon be over. The internment camps were located in hot, dusty, desert-like areas, which did not provide any sort of relief to the already poor living conditions. They were surrounded by barbed wire fences, along with armed guard towers, which they were told was for their protection. 6-year-old Amy Iwasaki Mass pointed out that if the guards were protecting them, why were their guns facing towards the inside of the camp instead of out? The encounter of perspective escalated the views of many, leading Japanese Americans to be treated as convicts instead of American citizens. They were allowed to work for pay but were given less than prisoner wage. They only received meager meals and rare visitor opportunities. The Japanese American internees were undoubtedly prisoners of their own country. Some people had the opportunity to leave the internment camp by applying to the application for leave clearance. Those that passed were drafted to the army or allowed to leave to work for a struggling farm, but they found that prejudice still remained outside of the internment camps. Some who did not pass were deemed enemies of the United States and sent to the harsher Tule Lake internment camp, or deported to Japan, an unfamiliar place to many. However, all the internees were finally released after 3 years, with the executive order's repeal in 1945. When the Japanese American internees returned home, they had to start over once again. All signs of their life before internment camps had either vanished or been obliterated. Many internees suffered from social amnesia, which repressed their memories, causing them to not speak about their internment camp experience. In fact, the Nisei, the second generation of Japanese Americans who intended to be born in America, were known as the Silent Generation. The internment camps were never brought up in public until the Sansei, the third generation, demanded a redress by the government. The civil rights movement in the 60s inspired the Sansei to start their own movement. They demanded the government to recognize the injustice their parents and grandparents experienced. Finally, in 1976, President Gerald R. Ford became the first to acknowledge the United States' violation of Japanese Americans' civil rights, followed by a formal apology and compensation of $20,000 through President Ronald Reagan's signing of the Civil Liberties Act in 1988. Many Japanese Americans deeply appreciated that their government recognized their wrongdoing, but nothing would ever be able to erase their experience and feelings of what they considered their imprisonment. It is truly undeniable that Pearl Harbor created a tragic encounter out of fear that would change American lives forever. The attacks on America on September 11, 2001 are tragic events similar to Pearl Harbor that still affect us today. The 9/11 attack influenced America's view about Muslims and Muslim-dominated countries by associating Islam with terrorism. The fear produced by these attacks resulted in an encounter which dramatically changed the view of Muslims in America, similar to how Japanese Americans were viewed after Pearl Harbor. As seen throughout history, these types of encounters can lead to terrible presumptions and the alienation of one culture. America must learn the effects of fear from history to prevent these unwanted and unexpected encounters from reoccurring. As President Roosevelt proclaimed while allowing former internees to join the military, Americanism is a matter of mind and heart. Americanism is not and never was a matter of race or ancestry. Japanese internment camps are an important part of America's history that should not be forgotten. A dramatic change in perspective of Japanese immigrants caused the creation of internment camps in both thought and deed. Not only were Japanese Americans discriminated against before Pearl Harbor, but they became the victims of prejudice after the attack. It was unfair and unreasonable that Japanese Americans had to suffer from the repercussions of Pearl Harbor. As the Japanese words Nidoto Nayoni state, let it not happen again.